Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our webinar. My name is Laura Malone. I'm Vice President, Non-Cash Donor Relations with Charitable Solutions. Happy to be here today to discuss both sides now. One advisor's story about his own charitable exit. Before we start going through some of our information, I just want to do a quick sound check, visual check. If you're able to see me and hear me, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand or throwing something in the chat. Thank you to everybody who's doing that right now. That way I know that we're in good order from a tech standpoint, which always makes my life a lot easier. So we will go ahead and get started with today's presentation. I want to thank, first of all, before we go into talking about Dechomai, I want to thank our guest, Rob Siegmann, from former co-founder of Total Wealth Planning, now managing partner at Carson Wealth. He's gratefully sharing his story of our transaction that we did last year. So we'll be talking more about that in just a moment. But first, for those that may be less aware of Charitable Solutions, we've been around since 2003, helping to make charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. We have a number of different entities that kind of fall under the Charitable Solutions umbrella. I'm going to start in the upper right with the one that's probably least known, and that is our Emergency Assistance Fund and the Emergency Assistance Foundation, which is a number of employer-sponsored funds that help with emergency relief for the company and their employees when they go through hardships. Most glaring example of that would be COVID. Another more recent example would be the California wildfires, but it is more of a global group that we serve. So we've also had in international areas where there's been hardship or natural disasters where there has been the ability for companies to be able to support their employees that are going through those scenarios. So currently there's about 420 funds all around the world, serving about 14 million employees, making about 300 million in grants in 2020 and 2022, which was kind of that post-COVID area. As you see with this webinar and other presentations, we also do education and training. So Bryan talks frequently at numerous associations, estate and legal conferences, all of those things. He averages probably about 60 to 80 of those a year, but a number of our team members also do those presentations as well. And that may also include more smaller training for board and nonprofits and their teams from an educational standpoint. So if there's anything that you need in that sense, we're happy to talk with you. Also, more recently, we've rolled out the Plan Giving AI tools. We have Frank and Max that are our own AI bots that we've created that focus exclusively on charitable planning questions. Information that feeds Frank and Max all come from the IRS, comes from various well-regarded charitable planning materials. Russell James has a lot of info in there. Our own publications are in there, so great material to pull from. Frank tends to be more advisor focused. So for those that may be attorneys, those that might be financial advisors, those that might be, advising clients on their planning, Frank is more geared to those folks, while Max is more direct donor facing. A lot of nonprofits have built in Max to their portfolio for having a resource for donors to ask questions about various simple charitable matters before they make a call to the charity itself. So those are all rolling out. Going into the center top, we have our charitable gift annuity risk management. So that is an area that we've been serving in for a number of years, doing risk management audits, comprehensive risk management plans, cash flow and financial modeling, large or concentrated risk analysis, typically for pools that may have 10 million or more with stress testing and actuarial information. Also, the idea of individual CGAs that may be $5 million and higher, where you may want to look at reinsurance or self-insurance and the reinsurance brokerage market. So that's an area that we play with the charitable gift annuities. And we'll talk a little bit in just a second about the National Gift Annuity Foundation that to some degree yins and yangs with that, but also charitable appraisals. For any time that we're not participating in a direct gift as the recipient, we can collaborate with nonprofits and various other institutions about charitable appraisals for gifts that they have made. So long as we're not participating in the gift, we are able to do that and do that in a number of instances with closely held business interests, with cryptocurrency, with restricted stock, life insurance, precious metals and jewelry, any of those things that can be, a good donor, good asset, doing good things, but maybe doing it directly with their nonprofit or directly with their donor advised fund where we're not being an intermediary. We can help in that service. Down in the lower left, we have the National Gift Annuity Foundation. This has been a great tool for nonprofits that may not have their own gift annuity programs and want to be able to have donors that are being able to leverage gift annuities. This is also a great tool for nonprofits that may not be licensed in every state, but may have a donor that is expressing interest about a charitable gift annuity in a state that they are not licensed in, and may not feel that they have the capacity to go through getting a new state license for what may be at the initial start a single donor or a single need. So this is a great avenue where we've seen a large amount of growth. We have over 1,200 contracts with a pool of nearly $110 million. Oftentimes what we are seeing as well is that those gift annuities are fueled with non-cash assets like real estate and like cryptocurrency and some of those other non-cash assets that are normally not part of what would be in the nonprofit's gift acceptance policy. Going into the upper left-hand corner, kind of our bread and butter and what brings you here most of the time is our non-cash asset risk management. So while we do have the capacity to help charities evaluate gifts prior to their receipt and give them some level of consulting about the receipt and liquidation of those assets, the largest part of what we do is that philanthropic middleman of sorts, being that nonprofit that's receiving the asset through our Dechomai Foundation, which is a donor advised fund dealing exclusively with non-cash asset gifts. I like to refer to it sometimes as a two-charity relay race. The donor's making the gift to Dechomai first. We're doing all the tax aspects of the charitable gift. We're doing the liquidation with the donor. And then once we have that liquidity, we're passing that cash along to the donor not to the donor, but to the donor's charity of choice. Oftentimes that can be a single issue organization. It could be a donor advised fund. It could be an organization. We've seen this relatively recently where the charity has its own program and do these gifts often themselves, but the donor wants to split the asset or the proceeds from the asset to numerous charities. So while the organization, if it was all going to that organization, would not use us, they do bring us in because they don't want to have that grant showing up in front of their board, in front of their donors about why charity A is granting X dollars to charity B as part of that commitment to the donor of making sure that the donor can support more than one favorite organization in that process. So we've done at this point over 7 billion completed in our tenure, going on nearly 25 years. And for last year, it was a very busy year for us. We more than doubled what we normally do in a year. And these are the latest, greatest numbers. If you were really geeking out like some of us do and actually listened on Tuesday as well, you'll know that these numbers are a little bit different from Tuesday. We did have our audit updates that we incorporated into this. So we did have 683 of these gifts that we did last year. As I said, more than doubled in 2024. That was 288, totaling about $1.9 billion in assets. The makeup of those gifts is really, as you see below, real estate, business interests spread across C-Corps, S-Corps, and limited partnerships and LLCs, cryptocurrency, cash, and then a mishmash of other things. As you see, when we look at these numbers, I do want to point out that there is a little bit of a blend, so to speak, based upon the gift, but also how the gift is legally structured. The best example I'll give on the front end is real estate. While we're showing real estate gifts at 81, those are ones where we actually transferred the deed. There's a small amount within the LLCs and LPs that would also be real estate, but that real estate was held in an LLC and the donor donated that LLC rather than transferring the deed of the real estate. So it does blend a little bit in the sense of the gift itself was the LLC, but the primary asset and only asset in that LLC was the real estate. Also, too, a little bit of a blend between the S-Corps and the LLCs and the LPs, because while the S-Corps are kind of the standalone S-Corps in their own right, you do have some of the LLCs and the LPs that are taxed as S-Corps. So while they will go through some of that similar S-Corp treatment, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, legally they were that LLC that's being taxed that way. So then you are seeing a little bit more of that blend within that number. Cryptocurrency was a very busy year of cryptocurrency for us. Cash is a unique one because, like I said, we do primarily non-cash assets, but this cash has been cash that's been coming to us for the purpose of a direct investment. So oftentimes we see the idea of there's a concentration that the donor wants in how they're investing in their DAF that might be outside of the purview of their normal DAF provider, or it's somebody that's coming out of an industry where they still want to be able to direct invest in that industry because they know the market so well, they know the players of the game, they might have friends that are building companies, early stage companies that they want to use the money in their donor advised fund to invest in those early stage companies. So that is becoming roughly about a third of our book of business, but it is a very unique set in the sense of it's money not being invested the traditional way, but being invested in these non-cash assets in some way, shape, or form. But the donor's giving us that cash to get the momentum started with that. So that is where I want to go ahead and point that out. And then with the others, last year we did see a little bit of an uptick in precious metals. The market's kind of, shifted a little bit in that. So we're not seeing as many of those inquiries as last year, but there's always something that comes across the board that's new and different. If you look on our YouTube channel for our weird and wacky assets, normally it's our November webinar. You can learn more about the different unique things that came across the transom last year as we were doing these transactions. So I want to go through quickly our agenda and just quickly point out as we begin to focus on the agenda that we do not traditionally share our slides in this. The webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. And since you registered, you'll also get an email with a link to that webinar when it's ready, but we typically do not share the slides in this process. So, but we'll quickly go through the agenda about a quick overview of those S-Corp, C-Corps, and LPs and LLCs. Rob will introduce himself after that, and then we'll start talking a little bit about this gift that we did together last year with his gift of total wealth planning and that sale process that we went through. Share a little bit of thoughts for owners and advisors in the nonprofit community, as well as open up to questions. So definitely feel free to type in your questions in the chat. Bryan may field some of the lowball ones that are easy to answer, through that chat, but then we'll also cover some live and we'll share on the YouTube channel and in the email all the questions that have been shared in both webinars, Tuesday and today, so that we can go through that and everybody can see what they might have missed in each of the webinars. As we look at the idea of why we do this, why the business interest gifts, why the charitable deductions of these S-Corps and C-Corps and LLCs and LPs, I do want to stress with any non-cash gift, and we'll talk about this a little bit as we go through this transaction in our discussion with Rob, all of these gifts do need a qualified charitable appraisal when you're claiming the charitable deduction. And that's especially true with S-Corp, C-Corp, and LLC, but it's also true with any other non-cash gift that we saw in the makeup of the gifts that we do. And that's an important thing for donors to recognize. And I do want to point out that while businesses do tend to get general valuations in the normal sense, the charitable valuation for the charitable deduction is a little bit different and is a little bit nuanced. So it's not like you can take the valuation you did when you're going to market and just slap it into your tax return and call it done. As we'll talk about, there's a definite nuance of about 10 to 12 items that are specific to charitable appraisals that need to have those items in there, or else the IRS may be likely to try and challenge the gift. We've seen a number of tax cases along those lines. S-Corps, like in this case with Rob, it really can be one of the more challenging gifts because of the unrelated business income tax exposure. And fundamentally, what that is that any charity basically inherits that basis. So while the donor gets the benefit of that capital gains avoidance, the charity is basically paying that tax bill on our side of the fence once it's thrown over the fence to us. And that does go ahead and reduce some of the charitable bucket at the end of the day, but the donor still is able to maintain that charitable benefit of that capital gains avoidance. But it is an added nuance that takes place within the S-Corp gifts, and then also too, sometimes within the LLCs and the LPs, depending on how those are structured and if they're being taxed as the S-Corps. C-Corps can be extremely easy. Oftentimes they're corporate level deductions, less or even none UBIT risk in a lot of cases. They may involve double taxation concerns, which is why the donor considers them good gifts, but they can be relatively easy to manage from a gifting perspective. And then with the LLCs and the LPs, along with the UBIT exposure that is along the lines of the S-Corps, another thing to keep in mind is debt and whether or not there's debt in that company. We see that a lot within real estate related companies. Oftentimes we don't get a lot of REITs, or we don't get a lot of apartment complexes or hotels because of the debt that they may be carrying that can sometimes, cannibalize that tax benefit to the donor and create added UBIT exposure for us. So if there's a low level debt, it might still be workable, but if it's something that's highly leveraged where it's 40, 50, 60% debt or higher, then more likely than not, it's not going to make a good gift for the donor. And oftentimes we see the donors, once they come to that awareness, kind of back away from that gift. So now the moment we've all been waiting for. I want to thank Rob again for being here. And if you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes, Rob, to just tell us your story and how you got here with this transaction.
It's my pleasure, Laura. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody who uh, joined and took time out of your day to hear our story and see how it might, relate to something that either you or a client, might be faced with, so you can provide, some anecdotal, notes from my story. So I'm a born and raised Cincinnatian, 49 years, a proud father, proud husband. My financial planning journey started back in 1994, so I've been in the business for quite some time. Um, I inherited about $15,000 from an uncle, unbeknownst to me, and it was such a surprise. And my local savings and loan or my CDs that I knew as a young man didn't make sense to me, so sought out a financial planner, and I learned about dollar cost averaging and commission funds with American funds, and this was the early 90s, and ended up working for him and learned more about the business sort of, and we built the business, brick at a time, client at a time. Slow and steady wins the race. It's our investment philosophy, and that was our business philosophy as well. Um, I was just so excited, to have an opportunity to invest as a young man in the 1990s when, doubling and tripling your money was kind of the norm back then. So my 15 turned into 50 very quickly, so I was hooked for my career. Um, my philanthropic journey didn't really start till around 2014 when I started getting involved with leadership development and, local community networking groups. It was just, I thought I had, made business success. I was, on the doorstep of becoming an owner of the business that I helped build, which happened in 2015, but just was so humbled by all of these amazing professionals who had all three of the components that I valued: personal, professional, and philanthropic. Well, I was missing that last piece. So started to get more involved, joined a board, started giving money away, and that felt really good. So that sort of led up to the business sale. that happened in 2025, November of 2025. And when we started that journey, it was an emotional journey as a business owner to hand your baby over to somebody else, but knowing that that was the right decision to stewardship what you've built, for the team, for your clients, and for yourself. And I have two other partners as well who are, a bit older than I am. So they were, making sure that they had a succession plan and a retirement plan that made sense given the valuations today for our, very attractive businesses, RIA businesses. Um, Knowing that there was going to be a lot of gain and knowing what was in my heart to build a social capital account for myself, my family, and hopefully pass on some of those charitable values, down generations. I started looking for opportunities how I would donate some of my business. And when I asked around town to the folks that I knew, as soon as I said S-Corp, everything just went over my head. Everyone's sort of eyes started glazing over and they're like, we've never done that. I didn't want to be the guinea pig. So through my relationship with Schwab and DAF Giving 360, they said, yeah, we don't even know how to do that either, but we can turn you on to Charitable Solutions and Dechomai. They are, who facilitates that relay race with a sale like that. So that's a little bit about me and my journey.
Thank you so much for sharing. And as we start to look at kind of the timeline of how this all came to be, as Rob mentioned, he was introduced to us in March of 2025. And normally within this process, there is a due diligence period that we look at the business. That if you think about, we are taking a certain level of ownership and, in that instance, we have to understand our own risks and liabilities with that. So we are looking under the hood in some ways, not too dissimilar from what the buyers may have looked at when they were starting and when other, intended people were looking at potentially buying total wealth planning and what they would look through in those documents. So the operating agreements, the shareholder agreements, the financials, the K1s, just to make sure we've got everything we need covered as somebody stepping into a small portion of that ownership role. The due diligence, usually takes about 3 to 5 business days, and I think that was pretty on cue with Rob. It might have been a little bit quicker when we did that, but ultimately, we came back around, and when we got that information, which was a little while after our initial meeting, sometime in April, we said, okay, we're ready to move forward with this. There was an assignment that we had that conveyed that ownership from Rob to Dechomai and Dechomai Asset Trust, and that assignment was signed jointly by Rob and by Dechomai on April 25th of 2025. And as part of, Rob's operating agreements with Total Wealth Planning, it had to be approved by the other partners in the firm, which they were happy to do, as I think Rob already alluded to. And this was a little bit ahead, and we'll go into in a minute, a little bit ahead of where the timing was for the gift. It was actually probably about, 4 to 6 months between, when this gift was made and when there was a letter of intent and when there was the purchase and sale agreement and all those hallmarks that we looked at. So there was a period of time where we had distributions that were coming out of Total Wealth Planning to its shareholders that we were collecting on those distributions. And Rob, I don't know if there's anything that you want to share kind of about this process, during this front end in regards to, the due diligence and what you felt like we might have reviewed or collected, or, the period of time of, those distributions and how those transitioned over, and just the time that we were co-engaged in, the ownership in that stage.
Yeah, all good questions. The distribution piece was pretty simple. We have our corporate account with our custodian, who's Schwab, and we just basically set up an automated monthly, and the percentage we were, sending out a draw on a monthly basis of X dollars, and we just redirected that portion that Dechomai owned. So, we just changed some of the logistics, but there was automation that was very easy, very possible. So that was a kind of a nothingness. It's just an administrative thing. Um, I think it was important that, and Laura, you mentioned this, that my both my partners and my investment banker, or the broker, business sale broker, that everybody was on board with me doing this because, we hadn't done it before, and I was concerned that maybe it could muddy the waters. Potentially, it could turn off a buyer, to have, an entity ownership or a charitable ownership of a piece. But there again, it's not uncommon, or I wasn't that unique. So everybody was aligned, everybody was okay with it. So kind of just made sure I checked all the boxes and that I wasn't going to disadvantage the transaction at that point. And then speaking to the timing, yeah, it was conveyed to me that you really don't want to gift shares of your business like on the doorstep of a sale. The LOI might be kind of the point of no return, or at least that's what I heard. Maybe you have a little more flexibility. It depends on how much risk you want to take with a prearranged sale. Um, and our business sale journey was about a 2-year marathon. It was exhausting. We've all had those calls from the aggregators, from the buyers, right? And usually you just ignore those calls and tell them to pound salt. But eventually you start, talking to those folks and you're like, wow, you have a lot to offer. And I can't believe how valuable my business is. So it took us a while to kind of go from some of those one-off conversations to then decide we should not be doing this ourselves. This is the most important decision we'll make. We hired a broker. Um, and then once we kind of had a general idea what our business was worth on the market, let alone there was a bump when you did the competitive bidding process, I said to myself, "Oh wow, that's more than I thought." And I need to evaluate how much and when to give some of this to a charity. And I think that's where, Charitable Solutions helped me, made the process super easy. I think it might have been like a 4-page document and then some internal, things that we did. And like I said, the administrative distribution, it was, again, how many hundreds of these have you done? Well, except for the S-Corp, there were 30 of them, but still, I do it once and you did it 30 times in a year.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, as you were kind of indicating, Rob, I mean, while your business is an RIA and, you're looking through that lens, a lot of that is not dissimilar regardless of the industry. And I'd say that that's true. I think oftentimes, the concern has always been introduced to us in conversations about, our engagement. Are we going to try to take over the widget factory? Are we going to try and strong arm certain things? And that really just isn't how it works. Oftentimes, especially if there's that time where we're in that ownership role and it's not really at the sale yet, like in those couple months that we experienced with Rob, we're really just kind of hanging out and collecting checks, happily so. So I think that's important to recognize, as advisors are talking with donors or charities are talking with donors about their upcoming liquidity events and the idea that this can be, less threatening than what they may envision in that process. So as we talked about, in regards to that window that Rob alluded to, oftentimes we do see, a lot of feedback as to where is that line in the sand. And, we do see a lot of gifts made right around that timing of the LOI. And everybody's CPA is different. So we strongly encourage, the donors talking with their CPAs about where they feel that line is. From an IRS perspective, for a long time, there was a thought that you could get relatively close to the purchase and sale agreement, but there's been recent court cases that have really kind of indicated the idea of even if you're not at that purchase and sale agreement yet, if the proverbial pie is kind of baked and you're just waiting for the crust to brown, then it's probably going to end up being an assignment of income issue. And, that's one of those things where it really helps to have that advice of the CPA as to where they feel most comfortable in this. And, I've heard various feedback from attorneys about how sometimes they like having the gift made ahead of the LOI because then the party can be in the LOI. Dechomai was in the LOI in this case. with Rob's transaction because we were already an owner on the cap table of whatever percentage we had at the time. So it's important, to really work with the team overall as to where that timing makes sense. The sale itself closed in mid-November. That was when the cash was distributed. I apologize, I didn't put in here the date that we signed the purchase and sale agreement. But I believe that was in September or October, if I remember correctly, Rob. Um,
Uh, this is the transaction, sort of our sale.
the actual signing of the purchase and sale, so not the cash. Wasn't there a period of time between the PSA when the cash paid out?
Just a couple days.
Just
We
a
just
couple
had
days. Okay,
some
so I am pretty much on
human
target with
capital
that date.
things to work out. Yeah, we were supposed
Yeah.
to close on November the 10th, but with these things, there's a lot of moving parts. To sort of have an official close 4 days late, we'll call that a win.
And in this case, with S-Corp sometimes, and with this type of business in particular, this did end up being an asset sale, which did create an additional kind of layer in this process that is a little bit unique in this scenario because, the assets of the company of Total Wealth Planning was what was sold. It was not the stock in Total Wealth Planning. Whereas Dechomai owned the stock in Total Wealth Planning. So while we had cash that was coming to us related to the assets and related to our ownership of that stock still hadn't yet disappeared. It still was out there and it was still tied to our ownership of that. So there did need to be actually a final buyout of the holdco, of the TWP holdco, buying us out of that stock so that we could get out of the ownership of that stock. And because it was a buyout by the holdco, there was a second appraisal being done at that time, to factor in what that market value would be for our buyout in that to make sure that, Rob or anybody else wasn't benefiting from any type of impermissible benefit in the eyes of the IRS with this transaction, factoring in the idea of, we were getting bought out with the idea of we're not participating in any future earnouts or any other future revenue opportunities and what that may build into that number. So that final buyout of us actually, Dechomai itself divesting from the TWP stock was in mid-March after some of the dust had settled from some of the other factors, that was, part of the process. And then, grants were made periodically throughout the whole process. So we definitely had those grants that were being made, once we had those distributions. But then we also had, a follow-up grant that came, with that first payout from that liquidity. And then we had a second payout as that part of that final buyout, which then created a second grant to Rob Stoner Advised Fund at DAF Giving 360. So, Rob, I don't know if there's anything you want to share. I did want to make sure that I followed up on the UBIT hold in the sense of because of that unrelated business income tax that we talked about early on. There is still some residual sitting here with Dechomai to make sure that we have the assets we need to cover our tax exposure related to our ownership of that stock. So once that's fully paid off with the IRS, once we've resolved that with the final K-1s and the final tax payments that we make from our tax returns when we file our taxes for 2025 and 2026, then whatever's remaining of that residual will be an added grant to Rob's Donor Advised Fund at some point a year or so into the future. So, Rob, I wasn't sure if there was anything you wanted to share about that part of the process.
Yeah. So as we mentioned before, Dechomai owned a piece of Total Wealth Planning when it was an active RIA, and we were sending distributions to Dechomai. Of course, I wanted to see that money in my donor advised fund, so I think it was James on your side that reached out really proactively and was like, "Hey, we're holding enough of your cash. Where do you want us to re-grant this to the fund where you can see it, you can invest it, you can start gifting it?" So that was really nice because, as anybody would imagine, we had our hands full with client work, team communications, going through due diligence, reverse due diligence of this process. So I was glad that your team was on it and reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, where do you want 50,000 to go?" or something like that. And then on the closure date, there were, a couple of components that TWP as the holding company now had. It had the, various components of the consideration. It had cash. It had some stock that we rolled into Carson Group Holdings or Carson Group stock. And then it had a rights to a retention, which was a 12-month retention bonus, and then rights to an earnout, which is an earnout based on a sort of a growth metric. And I don't think me nor Dechomai really wanted to maintain that ownership of those rights to those retentions and earnouts. So the cash piece was really easy, but how do you value an illiquid, non-publicly traded stock like Carson? Well, they have a valuation. Well, how do you value, a probability and a future value of a retention and an earnout? And that's where the qualified appraiser comes in. That's sort of not me, not Dechomai, total third party. And they did a pretty good job with it, but I ran it through the Dechomai team. They're like, there's like how many parts you're looking at, Laura? Like a dozen pieces. And they're like, hey, 9 of these look really good, but these 3, think you need to sharpen your pencil and do something a little different. Like just put the credentials of the appraiser on that page 7 so that when the IRS gets it, it's in really good form. So that was a value add. Because I think everyone maybe has a different format for what appraisal they would create, but exactly what the IRS is going to be looking for. So I think that was helpful. Um, so the cash instantly was, sent from TWP to Dechomai, and then Dechomai quickly turned it around, kind of like a relay race. And then, sort of as we sort of got our wits about us through the transition, then we started to say, okay, well, what does it look like for us to for me to buy my minority shares back from you? And that's when we did the valuation, and then there was a sort of a second amount of cash that was sent over to rebuy those shares, so that I now get personally the full retention and the full earnout and the full Carson stock. Um, Dechomai and my personal donor advised funds didn't want any of that stuff anyway. So that was why there was multiple sort of transactions that happened throughout this process, because it wasn't just a clean, here's a wire of cash, right? There were some illiquid and some likely, but not guaranteed future payments that we had to fairly value.
Yeah. And but I think overall, it still went very smoothly. And I think, that's a lot of that was because of that asset sale element. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that structure, but as we looked before about the different types of companies, if it were a C Corp, let's say, going back to that easier one, it would have just been the sale closed, we would have gotten a bucket of cash, and then everybody was walking away at that point without any of these extra steps. This is one of those areas again where it tends to be more unique in the case of an S Corp versus the idea of some of the other business structures where this can happen. So a lot of this will hinge when you look at this in regards to what type of asset structure we're dealing with these types of gifts. And so all these have their own nuance. Each, we did over 600 of these, close to 700 of these last year. Everyone had its own different unique nuance. So, you do one deal, you do one deal kind of thing. So, but we were grateful for everybody's collaboration in that process. I think one other thing that I just want to touch on real quick, and Rob, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but oftentimes the question that we get is related to our engagement in the negotiation of the deal,
Oh,
and
yeah.
whether or not we were involved or how involved we're going to be. And more often than not, the biggest things that we're looking out for are related to the reps, the warranties, the indemnifications, and the non-competes, and really just making sure that nothing's in there that's going to upset our charitable status as a nonprofit. But, aside from those things, I mean, all of this was really just kind of all total wealth planning leading the charge and us kind of along for the ride, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I would categorize it. And I think we knew early on that we were aligned in the sense that if we make a decision that is good for our team, that's good for our clients, and good for the owners, kind of in that order, well, then our interests are going to be aligned. We're not doing anything that there would be in my opinion, any issues between the two of us. But yeah, I mean, there was some communication along the way. It's like, hey, we think we're going to go with this buyer. Hey, here's the LOI. Is there anything that, you have to say? And you're like, nope, that looks, pretty good for what we need to see.
So, as you think back on this process, that now that you're, removed by a number of months since the sale, and you're back in your work mode and trying to do, your day to day again, what are things that you would think about in regards to, you have a client that approaches you about making a gift like this, or you have an advisor that is wondering if you could mentor them through this type of process and how they talk with their clients. What are some of those things that you would throw out there from this experience?
Yeah, I guess those are all good questions. So, I guess really the triggering event is kind of that emotional threshold that you get over that says, yes, I'm going to sell my business and I'm going to sell the entire business. Um, and then it's just like, okay, is there a part of me that says I want to be charitable as part of this process? Um, I practice what I preach. I hire my own financial advisor who is not with the firm. I just think that helps me with accountability, engagement, and keeps me pretty honest and objective about things. So we sat down and we looked at, what my goals and objectives are and my family needs and where I was and what could be some potential outcomes. And, we arrived at a number that made sense that, gave me an opportunity to build maybe a larger social capital bucket than I may have otherwise done. But I think just like with any decision, when a client comes to you with a big ticket purchase or a big idea, sort of run it through the lens or the filter of their comprehensive financial plan and what trade-offs exist or what, levers do we need to throw to sort of help that client meet that goal. So it was nice to have someone alongside of me to sort of help me with that. Um, I knew my plan B was just to go through the sale and, cut a check afterwards, but just like giving money to a charity, right? We'd much rather give an appreciated stock or ETF to that charity than write a check. The charity gets the same benefit on the either side, but, we as donors would sure like to have that double tax benefit of avoiding gains and getting the full write-off, subject to some AGI considerations. Um, so yeah, so I think I just kind of go back to everybody was on board. I needed the confidence, that this wasn't going to impede my ability to live the life that I wanted to live and to meet the goals and objectives of my family. But one of my big goals was to make sure that I could support the community, provide for the community, and provide in a big way, and and include my family as part of that process. And now I am just very blessed to have an account that if I don't start giving it away more aggressively, it's going to just grow out of control. So, starting to give some of that money immediately has been, such a source of joy in my life going through this process.
And that's actually a great segue, I think, in regards to, the thoughts for nonprofits. I mean, I think, you know, you've shared with me the idea of, how much easier, your grant making has become at this point, and certain strategies that you've started to deploy. Would you mind sharing that with the rest of the group?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is once you sort of turn that appreciated security, or in this case, a business, over to your DAF, there's one purpose for it. So you either use it or it just, you're just not using that resource that you put away. So to Laura's point, like I'll meet someone and they'll talk about a charity and it's an interesting, it's in line with, where my heart is. And I'll get back to my computer and sort of suggest a grant for, 1,000 or 2,500 bucks or something like that. And sometimes don't even need to think about it because it's like, hey, that's what it's there for. If I don't use it, somebody's going to give it someplace else, I guess, at some point down the road. And we all know that it's much more beneficial, and it brings us a sense of joy and happiness to, they say money can't buy happiness, but I believe that it does buy happiness when you use it for the good of others. So The other thing that I've done is, I've engaged my family. We had a nice dinner time conversation. I said, "Hey, family, we have this quota. We need to give away, X dollars per quarter, and there's five of us, and each of us are gonna, get to pick charities that we want to support that are doing good work that are close to our heart." Now, mind you, my kids are 7, 13, and 15. So a mixed bag of responses, probably a little heavy to put on the 7-year-old. But I was really surprised when my 13-year-old said, "Dad, I'm interested in supporting clean water." I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "What do you mean by that?" It's like, drilling wells in Africa. I was like, "Okay, who's doing great work in that area and what do they need? How do we want to support them?" So that kind of gave her the empowerment to go and look at that. She hasn't come up with her charities, it's still pretty new, but at least she kind of has some direction. And then I think the 7-year-old and the 15-year-old boy would just need a little more mentoring and encouragement to find where their hearts are and who they want to help. And um, there certainly were some questions about, you mean we're going to give that much away to charity and you're not going to buy a PlayStation 5 for me? It's like, that's not what this is about. This is about taking this blessing. This is God's money that we are stewarding. And if we hold on to it or if we use it for our own selfish purposes, that's a bad thing. But if we use it to improve the lives of others, that's why we've been given this gift. So, yeah, it's made it easy. You've already sort of made that mental accounting to put it in the bucket that we call our social capital account. And it does no good to sit in that account and grow. So it is meant to start giving away. So I'm on a mission to give it away kind of at the rate of growth that it is happening. And so far, candidly, we've been challenged to do that, but we're continuing that conversation to make sure that we are um, picking the fruit when it's growing and not just letting it fall to the ground and go to waste.
And I think that's a great example, Rob, in regards to I think a lot of nonprofits, still are struggling sometimes with how they relate to donor advised fund holders. And, not to say that all of you should be sending solicitations to Rob after this on LinkedIn or something saying, "Hey, I'd like your money." But, bear in mind, how easy are you making it for somebody like Rob to see you making it easy for them to give you money out of their donor advised fund? So, do you have stuff on your website that says, "Hey, this is our tax ID. This is what you need to give to your administrator at DAF Giving 360 or at whatever the donor advised fund may be to be able to make a grant to our organization?" When you get checks from donor advised fund holders and you have their name, you have their contact information, are you acknowledging them for that gift? Are you tracking them separately in your database as its own field of donors that have donor advised funds? Because I think a lot of that is great opportunities where there are folks like Rob that, want to be able to put this money to good use. They just may not always know how. And the easier you can make it to make it visible that you can be one of those organizations that can be recipients of those dollars, I think can be very beneficial to the nonprofits in being able to unlock more of that social capital that is in these donor advised funds with these donors that they may find previously challenging to get a hold of or challenging to distribute. So I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. And I would just think back to our previous slide a little bit in the sense of, Rob was very fortunate to have a great team of people that were very supportive of him doing this. And I think that is, and I think he might have alluded to it earlier, I think that is becoming more the norm. I've been working in this space with non-cash giving for 10 years now, at least. And, I think 10 years ago, there might have been more of a thought of some of the things that Rob addressed. Is this going to get in the way of the deal? Is this going to create a challenge? Are people going to be, not wanting to participate? And I find more and more it is the norm. It is something that's almost expected. So long as it's introduced to everybody early, I think there's still more frustration if you have this 11th hour choice to do this. But the more you pre-plan and the more that you pre-address the idea of wanting to make this type of gift, I think the easier it is for everybody to kind of get on board. And Rob, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on either of those points.
Yeah, thanks. There were sort of three parting thoughts I would love to share. The first was you can imagine after selling a business that dreaded call that you get from your CPA. It's like, hey, I've sort of worked it up. We're going to extend, but you got to send in a pretty, couple of pretty big checks. So I think it was a Friday evening. CPA, he and I talked at like 9 p.m. and he's like, Rob, what did you set aside? I gave him a number. He's like, oh, you're good. Like that's half of what, or that's twice what you have to pay in. Because I think mentally I was just thinking, okay, well, there was going to be the stuff, but that not only did the full charitable deduction come through, but the escape of the capital gains was a real pleasant surprise. So it's like, and maybe that's just the financial advisor in me. It's right, under promise and over deliver. And that's just sort of how I sort of operate. Go see a movie, you expect it to be not so great. So when it's a B plus, you're like, yeah, that was pretty good. So there really was an incredible tax benefit by doing this. So I'm really happy to have had all of the people around me that, my financial planner, Dechomai, my partners, to sort of help facilitate this with really little to no bumps and bruises along the way. The other thing that I want to mention is I actually have two personal donor advised funds. One is with DAF Giving 360, maybe formerly called Schwab. They're just a custodian. They've got a great tech platform, great investment opportunity set. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no resource there to reach out and say, I'm really passionate about helping underserved kids, breaking the cycle of, poverty and, really finding those diamonds in the rough and, giving them scholarships and boosting it up, through college and helping them find positions and networking because they don't have the rich uncle that owns a manufacturing plant or an RIA or something that can give them an opportunity. So that's where my heart is. I've not really gotten that consultative connections through my Schwab relationship. But I also have a DAF with a local community foundation here in Cincinnati.
Great
And
point.
the fee is higher, to sort of manage the money, the administrative fee. But boy, I could call them up and say, you know what, my daughter is really, passionate about clean water. Who's doing great work there? Sure, we could all go to GuideStar or some other, Google or AI tool and probably find out some stuff. But someone who is in the trenches, working with nonprofits, knows the leadership, kind of knows the impact, especially if I'm a big fan of wanting to support those organizations in my backyard, right? As I mentioned before, I've been 49 years, coming on 50 of Cincinnati. So like that's where my heart is, right? I want to start building my community. I want to provide for my community. So, and I just don't have the time as a busy professional, as a busy parent, to really go out and find some of that stuff at the moment. So having that relationship with the community foundation was really instrumental. And I kind of split my money between the two. So that advice has been worth the fee. Hey, we are all, any RIAs on the call, it's just like, the human element, that human connection, that's a premium in our AI and Google world. It's like, again, practice what I preach in terms of I'm willing to pay a fee for good advice and, good human connection to help
Yeah.
make the world a better place.
That's an excellent point. And we're going to take some questions in just a minute, but before we pivot to the questions, the only other thing I wanted to kind of point out in this was the idea of, oftentimes we do have the donor advised funds, and that's exactly what Rob did in this case. But there's also times that we do see, not so much with S-Corps, but with other types of business entities, the idea of the use of a charitable remainder trust. And that can be a great way for the donors to get a charitable deduction while also getting income. They get income for a term of years, and then the charity gets the remainder at the end of the time. Oftentimes we will see, like I said, S Corps aren't typically a fit in these instances, but if it's somebody that is, C Corp stock or real estate or some other type of non-cash asset, this can be a great tool to use to be able to have the best of both worlds in regards to that charitable deduction and that income. So definitely, as you're looking at your planning tools, whether you're advising a client or advising a donor or thinking about your own type of exit plan, that's also something that is easy to consider in that space as to, what may be a good fit. Bryan, do we have any questions that you want to throw out at us versus what you may have already answered?
Yeah, we've actually got a great one. Chris asks, this is very specific to Rob because the first word is Rob. As a financial advisor, how would you have responded or guided a client if they came to you with something similar to what you did and sort of what your goals were? And he sort of follows that up with he's very curious to hear if there would have been any trepidation or skepticism or how you would have wanted to be involved as the advisor with the transaction as well.
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. I would kind of go through a similar process, and I'm an advisor that believes in guinea pigging myself through a lot of things so that I can work with clients with a lot of confidence that I understand the process. There certainly probably would have been some trepidation before going through the process. A webinar like this, or maybe even, Laura and her team coming alongside you and just saying, hey, here's how it can look, because we all don't have the benefit of going through every life event that our clients do. But I would start with that financial plan and say, okay, you're looking to sell your business. You want to, get ahead of the charitable decision. Um, how much can you afford with a lot of confidence to part with from your estate, from this business sale? And, now is the time to start thinking about that and setting up, this non-cash fund. So again, I would put it in part of their financial plan, maybe not any different than like, hey, I want to go buy a second property. Can I afford that? It's, can you afford to do this? And I think as financial advisors, we've seen too many clients save their entire life. And they're like, I like the bigger number. And that just becomes their new floor. And they're like, well, I'll give when I get to 2 million. I'll give when I get to 3 million. I'll give when I get to 4 million. And or I'll travel, or I'll fly first class. And I think as advisors, trying to encourage some of our clients to um, um, explore their interests, their philanthropy, and we can only really say and give it a blessing if it's part of a comprehensive financial plan that accounts for the certainty of uncertainty in life. But that's how I would approach it. I would make sure I had a plan. I would put some what ifs in their plan. And if I didn't have a lot of confidence of the logistics and what the process looked like, I would find a provider to come alongside me and sort of help me with language, help me with a process, help me with an outline, so that I was, being sure to again practice what I preach. Just like we might farm out some estate plan work or some insurance work or some tax work, this is something that I would highly encourage getting an expert to come alongside us with.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No other ones. This is a less chatty group than Tuesday, but one's got to be more chatty than the other. That's just how math works. But as Laura said, we will be taking this question plus the ones from Tuesday and merging those together when we send out the video.
Yeah, and
Yes.
definitely feel free to check out any of our past webinar recordings. I did reference before in the discussion, we normally for November the last 2 years have done our weird and wacky gifts that kind of show a barrage of all the different types of assets that we've been dealing with. Also, for March of earlier this year, we did kind of our year in review of what we saw from the various transactions through 2025. But a lot of these on this list are showcasing things tied in with kind of the business exit strategies. But there's also a slew of others, more than 60 in all, that you can peruse through at your leisure on our YouTube channel, or you can go to our website to be directed to that. I want to go ahead and, Bryan, if there's nothing else that's come across, I just want to go ahead and thank Rob again for his time and his talent and his treasure in doing all this and making this a meaningful experience for him and for his community, and sharing his story. And Rob, do you have anything else you want to finish off with?
I would just offer that if I went to my first Carson event a couple of weeks ago, and came to the realization that I'm the old guy in the room now, so mentoring is in my spirit. So if there's anybody that wants to connect with me on LinkedIn and schedule a little side conversation, I'm more than happy to offer that to anybody who's maybe in that situation, looking at a client or considering something like this for themselves. Obviously not being paid for this conversation, but Charitable Solutions certainly has earned a lot of credibility and a lot of trust from my process of going through that with them. And happy to sort of share that off the record, all candor. I mean, transparency and trust is paramount to what we do. So happy to pass that along to anybody who's interested in connecting on, LinkedIn and having a side conversation sometime this summer.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your time and sharing your story. And for those of you still on the call, thank you for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next month with our webinars. Take care.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Bye. Take care.